We're pleased to be joined today by Caroline Glick, a world-renowned speaker, journalist, author, and expert on the Arab-Israeli conflict, a former IDF officer and graduate of Columbia University and Harvard University. Caroline is a prolific writer and the author of the books The Israeli Solution, A One-State Plan for Peace in the Middle East, and of Shackled Warrior, Israel and the Global Jihad. She's a senior columnist at Israel Hayom and a senior fellow for Middle Eastern Affairs at the Center for Security Policy in Washington. Millions of people throughout the world have read Caroline's insightful commentary. Caroline, thank you so much for joining us. Can you please share with us how you view the historic San Remo Conference and its connection to the ongoing struggle of the Jewish people to assert their legal, historical, and moral claim to the land of Israel?
Sure. Thank you so much, Tamir. Thank you to Tirtzu for really marking this important day, the centennial of the San Remo Conference. Because I think that the main significance of the San Remo Conference from an Israeli perspective, from a Jewish perspective, is that it demolishes the entire concept of competing narrative. And, we've heard for many years that there are competing narrative about the Israelis and the Palestinians, not to mention Israel and the Arab world as a whole. And we really don't know where the truth lies. And the best thing to do, if you want to be fair, is to try to split the difference between the two. Because what the San Remo Conference did was it recognized a basic truth. It shows that there is a basic truth, and you saw an instance of the entire world community, such as it was in 1920, agreeing what the truth was. And I think that that's very important in the world that we live in today. The Palestinian narrative of their conflict with Israel today is the same one that they've had for the past 100 years. They say that the Jewish people are strangers in the land of Israel. They say that we are today and we were in the past and we always will be colonialists with no roots that were sent to Palestine for no particular reason except for a desire to dominate the Palestinians, the natives. In other words, the narrative of the Palestinians for the past 100 years has said that the Jewish people are thieves and that we stole the land from its rightful owners and its occupants. The San Remo Conference exposes that this isn't a legitimate narrative. It's just as good as our narrative. It shows that it's a false narrative. It's a lie. Lawyers think that it's a problem that the San Remo Conference didn't have a map. When they said that the British mandate for Palestine committed the British Empire to implement the Balfour Declaration that called for the reconstitution of the Jewish homeland, of the Jewish Commonwealth in the land of Israel, it didn't include a map of exactly what they were talking about. But the reason that they didn't include a map is because everybody knew what they were talking about. The San Remo Conference that said that the British had to reconstitute the Jewish Commonwealth in the land of Israel was written by people who all recognized what the land of Israel was because they all shared deep familiarity with the Bible. And the Bible says that the borders of the land of Israel are the borders between present-day Jordan and Iraq, Mesopotamia. This was then discussed or set out explicitly in the mandate from 1922, where they said, in fact, that the border was between Palestine and Mesopotamia. So they saw the borders of the Jewish Commonwealth that the British were required by the conference, by the San Remo Conference, and later by the mandate of the League of Nations to implement. They saw that Jewish Commonwealth as a reconstitution of the biblical land of Israel. So this gets us to the truth. What is the truth? The truth is that the truth that was recognized by the entire world community is that the land of Israel belongs to the Jews. The Jews are the natives of the land. It's true that there were others who were living here, not that many, by the way, but there were others who were living here. And in fact, the San Remo Conference and the League of Nations mandate and the British and the Balfour Declaration from 3 years earlier, from 1917, all said that you need to guarantee the civil and religious rights of everybody who lives in the land of Israel, which, of course, Israel has always done. But the right to build a national commonwealth was something that the British were enjoined to do for the Jews and not for anybody else. And why? Because the entire world community recognized that there was only one nation on the face of the planet that ever viewed the land of Israel as its homeland, and that's the Jewish people. So again, there is no narrative here. There's a recognition of a basic historical truth. The land of Israel belongs to the Jews. It always has, and it always will. And it has never been the homeland of any other people. I don't think that people even thought that there was anything controversial about what they were doing. Even the Emir Faisal, who ended up becoming the first potentate in Transjordan, which became Jordan in 1946, made a deal. He accepted the San Remo Convention, and he accepted the mandate because he too didn't think that it was controversial that the Jewish Commonwealth was going to be reconstituted in the land of Israel. He wanted to get his share. He was supposed to get Syria, and ended up getting the booty prize of Transjordan. But he didn't have a problem with that. He didn't think there was anything wrong with it. It wasn't controversial. It only became controversial later on. Actually, not later on. At that time, in 1920, when you had Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was a rabid anti-Semite and later became a Nazi during World War II, he was a father of Palestinian nationalism. And he began developing, particularly from 1930 on, a concept of an identity which he never viewed, by the way, as localized to the land of Israel. He saw it as pan-Syrian, of the Arabs of the land of Israel, and that they were in fact the natives. But there was no historical record of that. To the contrary, one of the most interesting things that I came across in my research for my book, The Israeli Solution: A One-State Plan for Peace in the Middle East, was a leaked document from the Palestinian Negotiation Support Unit. It was part of what were called the Palestine Papers. They were sort of like WikiLeaks, but they were specifically about PLO documents for the negotiating team with Israel that were leaked to Al Jazeera and The Guardian. And this particular memo was sort of a frequently asked questions, an answer to a frequently asked question of why it is that the Palestinians won't recognize Israel as a Jewish state. And the answer was very revealing. They said that they couldn't possibly recognize Israel as a Jewish state because doing so would require them, would sort of encapsulate a recognition of the truth of the Jewish roots to the land of Israel. And if they recognize the Jewish roots to the land of Israel and the fact that the Jews are native to the land of Israel and not colonialists, then they also have to recognize, for instance, that the legitimate rights to Judea and Samaria, which is of course true under the Articles of the Mandate as well, that the Judea and Samaria are part of the national homeland of the Jewish people, and that the Jewish people have national rights to Judea and Samaria, so that their entire narrative would fall apart. If they simply recognize the basic fact that Israel is a Jewish state, then their entire tower of lies was going to disintegrate almost immediately. Now, this then brings us to where we are today, and why is it that there is an enduring importance to San Remo? And that is really for the same reason that nobody's really thought that much about San Remo for the past 70 years. There hasn't been a lot of talk about San Remo over the past 70 years since Israel was established. And the reason for that, again, is part of this deliberate concept of narrative history, that you can have different versions of the truth, that there is truth to the Palestinian narrative, that Israel is built on stolen land, that the Jews are colonial occupiers of somebody else's homeland. You see, they try to hide, and they still do, they try to hide the historical truth by doing a number of things. One of the things is by waging essentially a diplomatic and political war against Israel, and they've been waging this since 1920. And the diplomatic basically to replace truth with international organizations, so that you get a stamp of approval from the U.S. or from UNICEF, from various world organizations, that tells you that the truth isn't important, history doesn't matter. We're going to pass thousands of resolutions saying that Israel is a piratical state, that the Jews are colonists, that they don't have any right to their ancestral land, And that's going to build up this huge pile, this mountain of evidence that you have a basis in truth for your narrative, but that's not true. So that they've built up this entire edifice of lies that they claim as truth by relying on international organizations that are themselves corrupt. So that's the enduring importance of San Remo, and that's why it's so important to return people's attention to this founding document that really was a mandate for the Jewish state. And it also tells us something else that I think is important for us as Jews, Zionists, as activists who care about fighting for Israel to understand. You know, there were two very important episodes that occurred almost at the exact same time in 1920. On the one hand, in April, you had the San Remo Conference, and I think in February, you had the Battle of Tel Hai. And really, since then, there have been two sort of warring factions. War is too strong of a term, but rival factions in the Zionist movement. You had, on the one hand, the diplomatic Zionists, and on the other hand, you had the pioneering Zionists. And each side sort of has continuously argued, till this day, actually, that the other one isn't important, and what's really important is what we do. So you had people like Jabotinsky during the Battle of Tel Hai, who said, well, no, we shouldn't be fighting for Tel Hai because it's actually part of the French mandate, and we don't want to get in trouble with the French. And Tel Hai was an agricultural community in the Upper Galilee, right on the border of Lebanon. And the Jews who were there, who were building the community there, were attacked by Arab gangs from surrounding villages that were trying to destroy them. And were led, the Jews who were defending Tel Hai were led by the Jewish hero Joseph Trumpeldor. And so there was an argument, a really serious debates that took place in the Zionist executive in Tel Aviv about what to do about Tel Hai, because you had this community that was besieged. And should we stand and fight for it, or should we just walk away and save the lives of the young people who were there? And Vladimir Jabotinsky, Zev Jabotinsky, the head of the revisionist Zionist movement, was of the opinion that they shouldn't fight for Tel Hai because they didn't have that international mandate for Tel Hai that they had for other parts of the land of Israel, and therefore it wasn't worth fighting for because you didn't have the diplomatic agreement. But in the event, the Battle of Tel Hai became an epic battle in the Zionist ethos, and it was the basis for the empowerment, for the inspiration generations of Jews in the land of Israel and outside of it ever since. The extraordinary courage and bravery of the fighters, and particularly of Trumpeldor, who died there, have served as an example for Jews in Israel and around the world ever since. And it was an epic and important moment in developing the pioneering ethos for Israel, that you have to build the land with your hands, and you have to pay for it with blood. And on the other hand, you had 2 months later, you had this extraordinary diplomacy, the San Remo Conference, where we did have all of the powers of the world getting together and saying to the British Empire, that had just been the main victor in World War I, now you are legally required to develop the land, to open it to Jewish settlement, to open it to Jewish immigration. So this is months after Tel Hai. And a lot of people actually say that the Battle of Tel Hai had very important consequences for international opinion going into the San Remo Conference, so that they worked together. On the one hand, you had Jews who were fighting and they were building. On the other hand, you had Jews who were in the international arena arguing the case for the reconstitution of the Jewish homeland in the land of Israel, along the lines of vision for getting an international mandate to rebuild the country, to rebuild the Jewish state. And they work together all the time. And when we look at the diplomatic war that's been ongoing ever since, we understand that one of the reasons that you can win a diplomatic war is because you are developing facts on the ground. But as we saw in places like the Gaza Strip, where you saw the destruction of 26 Jewish communities in just a week in 2005, as if they hadn't been there, because there wasn't international support. And by the way, there wasn't a clear understanding domestically of how important they were for Israel's national security, unfortunately. But there wasn't a wellspring of international recognition of Israel's right to be in Gaza and why we had to be in Gaza. You saw that no matter how extraordinary your settlement enterprise is, if it's not backed by diplomatic recognition and diplomatic support internationally and also among Jews ourselves, then you're going to have trouble surviving. And this is really the word for the wise for the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria, because the more international recognition you have for the right of the Jews to be in Samaria, the more secure the communities are, and the better able Israel as a whole is in the long run in terms of maintaining both sides. You need to settle, you need to build, you need to fight, and you need to defend internationally. Getting international recognition, developing those ties with the international community, recognition of the historic truth of the Jewish attachment to the land of Israel as our homeland, all of these things have to work together. You can't have one without the other. And so San Remo was a significant and really singular moment in the history of the reconstitution of the Jewish national home in the land of Israel, because again, what you had was a wall-to-wall international recognition that this is the land of the Jews. And yes, there are other people here, but you dig a half a centimeter under the ground and you see visual evidence of thousands of years of Jewish presence and Jewish settlement of the land of Israel in every single corner of this country. So I think they recognized this at San Remo. They didn't think in terms of narratives in 1920. And I think that we have to restore that common sense and that basic recognition of reality in our dealings with outsiders today. We have to be willing to make the case for Israel because we have truth on our side. The same truth that the San Remo Conference participants recognized. And we also have the Zion pioneering ethos and the settlement movements inside of Israel that have settled this land. And we have today a thriving 72-year-old state on this land. And so all of these things work together. And without one, the others become weakened and under duress. So I think it's very important, under threat. So I think it's very important that we recognize this, we celebrate the centennial of the San Remo Conference, and that we teach about it to everybody that we come in contact with, because again, it obliterates the central claim of the Palestinians.
Thank you for that. That was fascinating. If I can just add one more question. So you were mentioning, our needing to just press harder on the diplomatic side, to advocate better, tell our story, strengthen diplomatic ties and so forth. But on the other hand, I believe we all see there are so many international organizations, some bigger than others, NGOs, other countries, all, working to basically spread their narrative, right? In our eyes, it's a complete lie. And basically, tear down the Jewish basic truth in the land of Israel. And so my question is, from your diplomatic point of view, where do you see, Israel can find an advantage point? Where can we actually tip this game, to our side, basically?
Well, what I found in my experience in speaking to international audiences, both hostile and friendly, really there's no difference between the two insofar as my experience has been. You simply have to be knowledgeable. You simply have to know the facts. And again, this is why your decision to highlight the centennial of the San Remo Conference is so key and such an important thing. And I really congratulate Tirtzu for doing this, because I think that there's too much ignorance in Israelis ourselves about our diplomatic history, about our diplomatic achievements, and about our national rights. And so in 1920, the nations of the world recognized that history and those national rights as a self-evident truth, because it is. And the truth is a really good product to sell. You know, if you think about what people sell in the business world, you know, you have people who sell air. I think that what's really important is for us to be armed with the facts. The more you know, and the more conviction that you have in your knowledge, and in fact, your conviction itself comes from the depth of your knowledge, the easier it is for you to make the case for Israel, and the more convincing you are. Yeah, I'll just share a very short story with you, which is that I don't know how many years ago, maybe a decade ago, I was giving a speech at a university, and it wasn't a large speech, it was to a seminar. And there were only supposed to be, I don't know, 50 or 60 people in the room, and it was a small, not a small, but it was a very large room. And suddenly there were about 150 people there, and most of them were dressed in a way that would indicate that they were hostile to Israel. And the professor invited me. I was actually pretty scared. And I began my speech, and I wasn't interrupted once. And when the questions came, I had a couple of, I guess, hostile questions, but I answered them. And the entire speech went off, and it was a very hostile campus as well. And the entire speech went off basically without a hitch. And as I was walking out of the seminar room with the professor who had invited me, he was in a state of shock. He said, "I can't believe that how do you explain that?" And I said, "How do I explain what?" And he said, "I can't believe that there wasn't a riot in that room." He said, "Half of the students in the room were there in order to riot, and you shut them up. They didn't even ask you questions. I don't understand." And I said, "Well, what do you think happened?" And he said, "You know what actually I think happened is that they realized that they couldn't disarm you, that you had too much attention, that you knew too much, and that they weren't going to be able to stump you or embarrass you, and that if they tried, that you were going to turn it around on them and they would be humiliated. And so they decided to just be quiet." And I think that it was, you know, for me personally, obviously it made me feel good, but I think it was also a very instructive moment. The more you know and the more you care, the better you are in making your case. And again, this just brings me back once again to why it is important to understand the diplomatic significance of the national significance of the achievement that the Zionists had at San Remo. That again, this was the first. It was the first sort of international event. Not, you know, you had the Balfour Declaration 3 years earlier, but that was an act of the British government alone. And 3 years later, at the end of the war, the Balfour Declaration and its commitment to establishing a Jewish homeland in the land of Israel and opening it up for Jewish settlement and immigration became a binding international document, became, most importantly, the declared sense of the world. It was a truth, and they recognized it as such before anybody came up with the concept of postmodernism and competing narratives. And we have to return to that basic foundational moment in the Zionist movement and the establishment of the state of Israel. We have to celebrate it. We have to teach it. We have to talk about it. So yes, I think it's very important.
Definitely, and I think that was a beautiful example. Now, you're known to support a one-state solution to the Israeli-Arab conflict. So from that side of the picture, what in your view are the critical changes we should see happening in order to actually make this more feasible?
Look, I mean, I think that perhaps I don't want to rank things too much, but among the many diplomatic achievements that Israel has accomplished over the last 100 years, you can mark the American government's recognition of Israel's capital, Jerusalem, then the transfer of the U.S. embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. That was a critical moment in Israel's diplomatic history, because again, it goes back to that document from the Palestinian negotiation support unit that said we mustn't recognize that Israel is a Jewish state, because if we do, then we can't not recognize Israel's national rights to Judea and Samaria. And so one of the biggest parts of that is the international fight against Jerusalem. Because, of course, you can't understand Jewish history without recognizing the centrality of the city of Jerusalem to everything about being Jewish, to everything about the Jewish people, to everything about Zionism, everything about everything. Of course, Jerusalem is Zion. So the concept that Jerusalem is somebody else's capital, other than the Jews, is both absurd and also highly destructive. Because again, if we don't have Jerusalem, if Jerusalem isn't ours, then what on earth are we doing here? I mean, everything we are is about Jerusalem. And by the same token, a very important, I don't know if from a sort of an existential perspective, is as important as Jerusalem moving the capital, moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, but perhaps it is. The statement, the declaration of the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo last year that recognized that the Israeli communities in Judea and Samaria are not illegal, that they're legal. This again goes against the grain of thousands and thousands of resolutions by international organizations whose purpose is to transform the concept of Israel into sort of a pirate state, that we've taken over somebody else's land, that it doesn't belong to us. And it goes back again to that leaked document from the Palestinian negotiation support of it. That they don't want anybody to recognize that, of course, Jews come from Judea, that, of course, this is our ancestral homeland, that, of course, we have every right to be in Judea and Samaria and to assert our national rights and our sovereign rights in Judea and Samaria. I think from that perspective, we've had extraordinary diplomatic accomplishments over the past 4 years, and to a certain degree, the fact that even the incredibly hostile Obama administration wasn't able to completely undermine the truth, no matter how hard they tried, I think is also a diplomatic achievement. But so from a diplomatic perspective, I think that what we've already accomplished in the last 3.5 years with the Trump administration is sort of an earthquake, and it's an extraordinary one for us. And in terms of achieving then the Israeli sovereignty in Judea and Samaria, I think a lot of it is just a matter of Israeli will at this point. We have an international writ of legitimacy from the most powerful country on earth to apply our law, and through that our sovereignty over parts of Judea and Samaria. And my sense is that now, it's true that the Palestinian national movement, such as it is a movement that exists in order to negate the Jewish national movement. And so that means that the stronger Israel is. And we strengthen ourselves by applying our law to the Israeli communities in Judea and Samaria and to the Jordan Valley. The stronger we are, the weaker the Palestinian national movement is. The weaker we are as a national movement, the less confident we are in our rights, the more powerful. So I think that we're going to see an ebb of the Palestinian national movement, which again is based on and a negation of Jewish identity, Jewish history, Jewish rights. It's an inherently poisonously anti-Semitic effort. So I think that that it's what we, when we see the weakness of the Palestinian national movement, are going to strike the iron as hot and decouple the Palestinian people, the Arabs who live in Samaria, from the PLO. Or we're going to continue to save the PLO to fight another day, to get until we're weakened in another way, and maintain their campaign against us. Because I think that by applying the Jordan Valley to the Israeli communities in Judea and Samaria, as the Trump plan foresees in the first stage, this isn't the end, not in the Trump plan than anywhere else. You set things in motion that can bring about the assertion of Israeli law, throughout all the areas of Judea and Samaria that we need in order to secure our national and strategic interests in the long term.
Wow. I couldn't agree more on your last example. Thank you, Caroline, for this wonderful and fascinating talk. And Yashar Koach. Hope to see you again.
Yashar Koach to you, Team Tirtzu, and all the students, and not only here in Israel, but also abroad, who are fighting a very difficult battle for the justice of the Jewish people, the Jewish state. You should have all the support you need, and you should have success, because your success in Israel and outside of Israel is the success of the Jewish people. Thank you very much.
Amen. Toda.